Great, thanks so much, Madison. I think we all know you now, so no problem with the later introduction. For those of you who haven't seen my face on one of these climate conversations before, my name is Kristen Schmidt. I work with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, but I live here in Duluth, so really happy to have discovered this group and have been involved with climate conversations for a little while now. And just before we kick it off to our speakers, I just wanted to make sure to say thank you to the groups and the individuals that are involved in supporting our monthly climate conversations. So that includes Minnesota Sea Grant, as Madison mentioned, Wisconsin Sea Grant, 1854 Treaty Authority, the Minnesota DNR, and specifically the Lake Superior Coastal Program, and then NOAA's Office of Coastal Management. So thanks to everyone who's been involved in putting these on. And for folks who have to leave early, I did want to mention that next month, we'll be sending out an announcement shortly, but the November climate conversation will focus on the topic of solastalgia. So, dealing with some of the psychological effects of a changing climate. And we'll have more coming out about that soon. But for this month, I'm really excited about our climate conversation. We really wanted the focus of the October session to be on ecosystems, and specifically, our Northwoods ecosystems in Minnesota, and how do we help those cope with a changing climate? And how do we help promote biodiversity under a changing climate? And so our two speakers today have a lot of experience with this. They're doing some really interesting work on the ground, trying to answer some of these questions in Minnesota and beyond Minnesota. So our speakers today are Meredith Cornett and Mark White, both with the Nature Conservancy, and specifically the Nature Conservancy in Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota. And I'll let them introduce their topic a little more and talk a little bit more about who they are. So for right now, I'm just going to start by kicking it off to Meredith. And thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for the invitation. It's been a while since we've been here with the Twin Ports climate conversations. And so it's wonderful timing because we have some new tools and data to share, along with some different approaches for forest management. And before we get started, I just want to give a big shout out to our colleague, Mark Anderson, who is not on the call today presenting, but he is the thought leader on a lot of this work. He's the principal investigator for the Resilient and Connected Network analysis that was just completed for the full US, and has just been really generous with his time. And much of the material you'll be seeing here today is provided in part by Mark Anderson. So we really wanted to acknowledge him up front. And so I've been the science director for our local chapter of the Nature Conservancy for about 15 years. And to tell you a little bit about me, I am a Southerner, born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, living north. And my relatives and friends in the Atlanta area are often really surprised when I tell them that northern Minnesota is one of the fastest warming geographies in the whole United States. And what that means is that adaptation and resilience thinking is especially important in this part of the world, especially for our Northwoods. It's just an urgent need. So we'll be sharing about these new tools and data sets, our collaborative approach to climate adaptation in northern forests, and hoping to jumpstart a conversation about how we set priorities for restoration and resilience in this really special place. And then finally, Mark is going to be presenting on two different approaches to adaptation. It's just a little bit of a spoiler alert: resilience and transition are two complementary approaches, and he'll be discussing how these new maps and tools can help us decide where to deploy those on the landscape. And I will now flounder here as I try to advance the slide. Okay. So this has been a huge team effort. To try to get something like this done across the whole US is just a big logistical challenge. We started out in the eastern US, hopped over to the West Coast, and then started filling in the middle. More than 150 scientists worked on these data sets, both within the Nature Conservancy and outside of our organization, many agency partners. And shown here is the team that worked on what we called the Great Lakes and Tallgrass Prairie, one of the 9 loosely defined regions that are represented across the US for this analysis. And so you can see the arrows pointing to my little head and Mark's little head in this photo. We were part of it. But I also wanted to introduce you here to Mark Anderson, who I mentioned previously. His colleagues, Arlene Olivero and Melissa Clark, all out of the Boston area. So this is the power trio that really made this work shine across North America with their brilliant spatial analysis. And then finally, to give some big props to especially our funders, and in particular the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, because without their investment in this work, it would not, any of it really have been possible. So the big motivator and underlying factor here behind this work is that as we think about the crisis in biodiversity loss, we are not winning the fight. So that is pretty bluntly put, but there have been some recent very sobering studies that have demonstrated that in terms of native species across amphibians, butterflies, mammals, we are down in total biomass alone since the 1900s. So that in itself is pretty sobering. And then at the end of last year, Ken Rosenberg and his colleagues at the Cornell Ornithology Lab put out some analyses that showed that the sheer abundance of birds is down by 30%, and that amounts to 3 billion birds. And the reason that I want to flag this is not to fill everyone with despair, which I know is easy to do these days, but mostly to flag that this was true for every habitat except for wetlands. In wetlands, we've actually gained in total abundance of birds, and that has to do with some of the adaptive harvest regulations we've invested in, as well as billions of dollars that we've spent on wetland protection and restoration. So although I'm going to be showing some kind of daunting numbers in the next few slides, I think it's important to recognize that we can actually multi-solve around this issue and decide where it's most important. Where are we going to get the biggest return on our investments in conservation? And part of the Nature Conservancy's answer to that question is the resilient and connected network. So I'll flash up a map of that here in a moment. But because we are the Twin Ports climate conversation, I want to flag a second issue, which is above and beyond the question of habitat loss and species loss. We also know that we're dealing with a changing climate. And this is not necessarily something that we can abate easily through habitat conservation alone. We need to be thinking about the change in ambient temperature and moisture, and how to survive these dramatic changes that are occurring. Nature actually needs to be able to rearrange. So I find this study really fascinating. As an example, this is from Fay and others in Science Advances. Of the 86 different tree species that they studied, they found that on average, they are all moving, their progeny are moving roughly 11 miles west per decade and 10 miles north per decade as temperatures warmed between the 1980s and 2010. And so mostly following moisture patterns as they drift to the west. And this was consistent with other global studies that have shown that species are also moving upslope where they've got a slope to move up. That's not necessarily what's going on in the relatively flat Midwest, but in mountainous regions, and then also northward. So clearly nature is on the move. And as we think about how we work to reverse that trend, we also have to acknowledge that the landscapes and the watersheds and the seascapes that we invest in are changing as well, more rapidly than we understood even a few years ago. And so we really need to be thinking about how we can get the biggest bang for our buck as we invest in these conservation practices. So this resilient and connected network is really a vision for biodiversity conservation, that if we can commit to it, we think that it can sustain nature and help it adapt to a changing climate. So in a nutshell, this is a network of resilient sites, and we'll be circling back to this map after I give a little bit of detail about how it was developed. But we want to be thinking about resilient sites that are configured to represent the base geophysical habitats in the region. We want to think about sustaining movement of species over time in a very altered landscape. As we know, human activity has fragmented and altered and put up a number of barriers to species movement. And then we also need to be thinking about where our best examples of biodiversity intact habitat are today. So that's what I'll be focusing on in the next few slides. But first, I'm hoping you'll just take a moment to linger here, because this network contains roughly 33% of the lower 48 US land base. So that's a pretty daunting challenge ahead of us. And yet, if we go back to our wetland bird example, it's one that we know that we are going to be able to accomplish if we're pulling together on this. Getting into the underlying maps, because the previous map of the full network that I showed is an integration of 3 different very robust data sets. The first one is my favorite. I can't say exactly why. I just love it. It's called Conserving Nature's Stage, and this is the resilience piece. So the green areas on this map show the places that ranked the highest because they had a large number of microclimates, and also they're very, very connected. So microclimates so that species can pick and choose amongst what's available, even as the broader climate around them is changing. And then connectedness, so they actually have a way of moving from place to place within those microclimate networks. So our definition of a resilient site, in this case, resilience is a term that gets used in a lot of different ways today, but our definition emphasizes that we expect these sites to continue to support biodiversity into the future, and that's based on their geophysical properties. So we do expect that the biodiversity, the composition is going to change over time, but in some of these dark green areas, we are anticipating that the turnover may be a little slower and that we may be able to hang on to some of the representative species that are even there today. And the areas, there's sort of a spectrum of color here. The areas in the darkest brown are considered by this analysis to be the most vulnerable to climate change. And just one more word about that Conserving Nature's Stage map, the representation within the resilient site network. And this is showing our local geography, the Great Lakes and Tallgrass Prairie, as well as the Great Plains to the west. You can see all of the different types of settings that, that we used in this analysis. And the main goal here is to make sure we are conserving a subset of each, and ideally the most resilient set, so the most connected and with the most microclimates. Moving into our second set of maps, you can kind of see in this graphic, if you've seen it before, you may recall that we've done some pretty sophisticated, not me and not Mark White, but Mark Anderson and his team have done some pretty sophisticated modeling using a tool called CircuitScape to create this visualization of flow. So this is looking at the direction and the concentration of species movement over time. So if we succeed in conserving these species, they will produce offspring. The offspring then need to disperse somewhere, and they expand and test out new areas. So as the temperature and moisture regimes are changing, these formerly unsuitable habitats may become suitable over time. And then they're available for colonization. And then this is kind of a gradual movement and shifting of species. And that's what we call climate flow when they're doing that in response to climate change. So you can see that there are some high flow areas, some concentrated flow, like in the east around the Appalachian Mountains. We kind of call that a pinch point. And then diffuse flow in the west. So if we represent those on our map, we come up with something that looks more like this. Sort of a still shot. And this is telling us what we have to work with in terms of where and how nature can move. So again, you see lots of areas of concentrated flow in the east, and in the west, a lot of the blue, that's diffuse flow. And up in our Arrowhead region of Minnesota, even, there's some really nice diffuse flow. And then this becomes our framework for linking the network together. So those first two maps were really based on the physical environment and how humans have affected the landscape. To ensure that a resilient and connected conservation network results from all of this analysis, we need to make sure that we understand where today's biodiversity is. And this is an example that comes from our Upper Manitou Forest Preserve right here in Northeast Minnesota near Finland, and some of the species that live there. So features like intact habitat and high quality communities and viable populations of rare species, this is all really critical information. And we had access to some great information along these lines across the US, but especially in Minnesota, because we have a really strong natural heritage program and biological survey. And so here comes another really cool map of recognized biodiversity value. So to represent the biodiversity that we have on the landscape today, we borrowed from these natural heritage program data sets, state wildlife action plans, Conservancy conservation plans, what we call our ecoregional plans, and other biodiversity planning documents, and created this comprehensive data set that's really cool because it contains a ton of information about all the native plants and animals and intact habitats around the US. And it gives us a really good snapshot of the places where nature is thriving today. And so that gets intersected with our resilience map in order to figure out which of these places are also considered resilient to climate change. So the final map brings those three different layers together: resilience, flow, and diversity. So we get this picture of 33% of the land area, roughly, how it hangs together in terms of flow. And we know that this reflects on the order of 250,000 records of plants, animals, and natural communities across the US. So it's embedded with a lot of information. One of the things that's also really interesting is that in the last few years, we've had a couple of major conservation visions and initiatives come out: the Global Deal for Nature and the Convention on Biological Diversity. And so the Connected and Resilient Network is a framework that we can use to think about both of these things on a global level, especially how the United States might contribute to that. This is a little sobering because it means if we think about 30% of what's left unprotected, we're talking about approximately 90 million acres, which could be, an analogy would be doubling the area that's already in the national park system, including Alaska. Or thinking about our neighbor state, Wisconsin, it's 2 Wisconsins worth of conservation that we're saying we think we need to commit to by 2030. And then I also want to really emphasize that when you go to download these products or to use the online tool at resilientland.org, you will notice that there are some grayed out areas. These represent the indigenous lands, the sovereign nations across the United States. These are places where we want to have a conversation with the tribes to ensure that we're not sharing data that in a way and at a time that it's not acceptable to do so. So we really, those are conversations that we still need to have. And we did use nationally available, publicly available data for this, but the analysis itself, as you saw, is an integrated approach. And we really want to have those conversations before these data are public. So to sum up, our challenge here is really to accelerate the pace and scale of conservation so that we can keep up with the pace and scale of climate change and create this representative network of resilient and connected lands and waters so that we can help nature to adapt to climate change. I haven't spent any time really talking about this, but I want to just point out that this isn't just nature for nature's sake. We recognize that people and nature are intimately connected for our well-being and survival. In the Eastern US, the Conservancy has been working with a network of scientists to look at the value and quantify the ecosystem services that this network provides. And so everything from clean air at the top to climate mitigation through carbon storage, going all the way around the circle to recreational values, to source water protection, pollution mitigation, all the things that we know nature does for us. A lot of that can be provided within the context of this network. One of the reasons we were so excited to come and talk today is because now that we have this national data set, we're really promoting its use by our partners here in Minnesota and throughout the US. So I wanted to give a few examples in Minnesota of how people are already using the data. So this is Jennifer Corcoran with the resource assessment team at the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, and she incorporated a couple of the data sets into the State Forest Action Plan. It might be able to inform some of the ways we think about forest management. Here's an example from Soil and Water Conservation District. They've been using the online tool, which you'll have a link to in the fact sheet that will be made available after today's presentation, to prioritize and pinpoint areas that make the most sense for riparian and wetland restorations. Another data set to factor into those kinds of considerations. And then the Minnesota Land Trust, which has done a tremendous amount of conservation in Minnesota alone, has been using this to help prioritize those places that are most likely to withstand some of the most severe impacts of climate change. So another layer to bring in into consideration along with many other local data sets. And then finally, this is the Superior National Forest. If you visit our story map about the network, you'll see that this is site number 21. It shows up as being very resilient and having great climate flow. And Katie Frecker with the Forest Services talked about some of the ways that they're using it in forest planning and even thinking about some pretty thorny issues like assisted migration. The Nature Conservancy has been already using this data for a few years to prioritize our land conservation. And recently we made a purchase that showed up in a couple of media outlets the week of October 7th, it looks like. So more than 2,000 acres in the Superior National Forest. Again, that very resilient landscape. And this is one of the last remaining private tracts of its size, very close to the boundary waters, where the investment just seemed like the right thing to do to maintain the high resilience of the surrounding landscape as well. So just to cue Mark up a little bit, we've also been using this data set in conjunction with other layers to highlight the places that it makes the most sense, not just to buy land, but to work with agency partners on forest restoration and resilience. So he'll be talking about a couple of projects, one that really focuses on transitioning forests through species adjustments to sort of a new iteration of the Northwoods, and then also how we use it to target restorations to climate resilient sites. But I have to stop sharing my screen so Mark can share his.
Okay, can everybody see my screen now? Is that showing up? Okay, you can hear
Yes.
me and everything too? All right, great. Yeah, anyways, thanks Meredith for all that great look at our resilient and connected network products. So yeah, I'm gonna get sort of more kind of down on the ground and look at some projects on forest adaptation and get in a little bit to how these relate to resilient and connected networks and kind of how we might use this tool for prioritizing management, really where we do things and what we do in particular places. So yeah, I'll just quickly do a little bit of context, look at our study region, talk a little bit about northern forests and how species are responding to climate heating. A little bit more about, partnerships and the work we do with agencies and also research partnerships and just how important all that is to the, this kind of work. Then we'll get into a little look at, applying some of these resilience strategies in forest management, climate adaptation, and then a transition strategy, and then talk, a little bit about how we can sort of, just some concepts about how we can incorporate resilient and connected networks into climate adaptation. And to some degree, we've already done that, but so yeah, our study region is this sort of transition zone, right? North temperate, southern boreal forest transition zone. So boreal trees are at the warm edge of their range. Temperate species are at the cool edge of their range. And it is an area that is, dominated more by boreal tree species. So kind of what's happening out there is we have these sort of cold tolerance growth trade-offs, right? I mean, it's a lot more complicated than that, but essentially the boreal tree species, they have greater cold tolerance, but the trade-off is that they don't grow as fast, whereas temperate species are less cold tolerant, but they can grow a lot faster. So in this context of a, climate heating, rapid warming, temperate species have this competitive advantage. So, that's, anyway, that's an important part of the story about what's going on out there. So yeah, climate has been heating up a lot over the last century, and in particular over the last 40 years in our region. So yeah, I just wanted to say a little bit about our restoration work that has been going on in northeastern Minnesota through our forest program. And in particular, Chris Dunham, our resilience forest manager, along with his crew. And this map just shows, this is probably out of date by now, but all of our restoration sites in northern Minnesota. So we're working on about 20,000 acres. We've put in about 4 million trees on the ground. We follow the full suite of practices. They're planting through browse protection and release. And, this work started out really focusing on this historic range of variability and trying to build resilience through increasing native species diversity. And that's still going on, it's still a big part of our work, but, we're kind of shifting to some other practices too. And I just wanted to highlight that these partnerships are just a big part of getting this work done, right? The Superior National Forest, Lake County, St. Louis County, and these partnerships developed through landscape collaborative groups. That maybe isn't as important now, but there is extensive planning and cooperation that goes on. And, the other partnership part I just wanted to mention really briefly is that with all this restoration work out there, we have these opportunities to essentially embed research into restoration. So we have these, real world forestry projects going on out there that gives us a way to, address these critical applied research questions. And in this case, we're going to talk about a couple of those applied research questions. So I'm just going to go through kind of two complementary approaches to forest adaptation. Our first one we're going to talk about is conifer strongholds, in which we try to target the restoration of boreal species to climate resilient sites. And that's based on one of the key components of resilient and connected networks. And then we'll kind of look at, adaptation forestry, which is a transition approach, which is essentially assisted population migration of temperate tree species. So the conifer strongholds part, right? We're talking about boreal conifer restoration on what we hypothesize are climate resilient sites. And, as Meredith said, resilience is a term that's used a lot. And so the context of what it, is really important. And, in this case, we're talking about the capacity of physical sites to maintain species diversity and ecological function in a changing climate. And so this work, a big part of it is based on landscape diversity, which is a key component of resilient networks. Essentially the concept is landforms control the distribution of, moisture, nutrients, and, climate effects, and, create this microclimatic buffering. And so if you have high landscape diversity, it means you have a lot of microclimates there. Species can move around. There's more available habitats, niche space, that kind of thing. And then we also incorporated regional climate variation into this, because there is significant variation in temperature and precipitation over time. And that also influences, resilience at site and landscape scales. Yeah, so our hypothesis here was that planting these boreal conifers on resilient sites, high landscape diversity, cool, moist conditions will result in higher survival and growth. You can see the landscape diversity map, on your left. The greens are the above average and high and far above average landscape diversity conditions. And you can see this, look at temperature patterns, that there is quite a bit of variability in temperature patterns, at this regional scale. And so that's another factor we can use to just, if we're going to try and be intentional about this, what we do, we can, it's important to look at this variation in climate patterns as well. So what we've done with this project was planted more than 100,000 conifer seedlings across resilient and non-resilient sites. Primarily boreal species, with the exception of white pine, but white pine, white spruce, black spruce, cedar, tamarack, jack pine in particular. And yeah, so we don't have any real results yet, but So we put out 150 permanent plots on 20 of these sites representing these different resilience classes. We've done baseline measures. And we also have 50 permanent plots on 4 research natural areas, which kind of represent background, natural conditions, natural regeneration on unmanaged sites. So, we'll be remeasuring that stuff next year. So we've talked about a resilience strategy, and adaptation forestry is really a transition strategy, right? So, we can establish that this climate heating, does drive this boreal to temperate shift in terms of species composition. But, so one of the things we think, is going on is that, there's I'll call it a migration lag, right? So if, this, climate heating is driving this shift, why do we need to worry about, transition strategies where we're moving species and genotypes? And so what the empirical data and modeling suggest is that migration can't really keep up with the rate of climate heating. So hence, transition strategies might actually be a pretty good thing to do. So, we look at temperate species that are predicted to increase, maples, white pine, oak species, basswood. In this particular instance, we picked two oak species, red oak and bur oak. So our hypothesis is that rapid heating, with rapid heating, the local temperate ecotypes, may already be maladapted to the current climate. And so we test that by planting red and bur oak from a local seed zone and 1 seed zone south. So we used 16 sites, about 3,000 trees, randomized block design, so we can test some of these effects. And so the overall project, there's about 100,000 trees went in the ground, bur oak, red oak, and white pine from 2 seed zones. And here you can see kind of how our planting locations are arrayed across this area of northeastern Minnesota. So they're about 1 degree latitude and 1 degree longitude, essentially, is the distribution of sites. So just a quick look at, what we learned so far is that the southern seed sources did have higher survival rates. You can see that, with bur and red oak on north and south sites. It basically tells us that natural selection is favoring, plants with these southern traits, which are things like longer leaf retention and thicker leaves, which is it's essentially a moisture, water retention strategy. Leaf retention, thick leaves, and the other thing that I think notable thing that, we saw with some of these oak species, in particular red oak, was just the phenotypic plasticity. We see this really pretty pronounced variation in leaf thickness on a latitudinal gradient. So in the southern part of the study area, they have thicker leaves, it's kind of warmer, moisture retention is more important. Further north, the leaves get bigger and thinner, they can create more photosynthetic surface area when it's cooler like that. So, and I think the other key finding was that those fixed seed zones based on past climate are really no longer applicable, at least for these species we've been working on. And so, there are some new approaches to seed zones out there that should be coming online soon. But, I think the other thing that this underscores is just the need for more work like this, more provenance trials, more experimental planting, I mean, we've learned a little bit from this project, but there's really a lot more that we really need to know. So yeah, so now I'm going to circle back a little bit to just thinking about, kind of how we can use some of these resilient connected networks for prioritizing restoration in forested landscapes. And, if we want to scale up resilience and, adaptation-based management, we need to prioritize where we work and, what actions we take on those particular places, right? So this map on the left is kind of an attempt to do that. So we've used resilient and connected networks combined with a map that estimates kind of complexity of forest structure as a surrogate for just forest condition. So, more complex forests are typically more resilient. They have greater species diversity, structural diversity. They're as compared to, more simplified, low species diversity forests. So anyways, we combine those two maps and come up with these priority restoration landscapes, along with these corridors, which are essentially kind of migration corridors that typically follow river systems. And, so anyway, so how do we, use some of this information? And I think, so northeastern Minnesota, I'm just going to zoom in here a little bit. It's an area with a lot of, a high concentration of resilient connected networks and also relatively high forest complexity. So what that gives us is many options for resilience and adaptation. So we have this, high microclimate, high landscape diversity, connectivity, as well as climate flow. And just for example, we can, if we want to use some of these resilience strategies, we can target restoration of boreal conifers on those cool, moist sites, with high microclimate diversity. So that even when, even as temperatures are warming, they may still have, suitable habitat in those landscapes. And, temperate trees, high microclimate diversity, warmer sites, high microclimate diversity, high connectivity and climate flow. I mean, just a couple examples of, how we might think about it. And, I don't think we've gotten really far along the way of how we're going to do that. But anyway, those are just a couple of examples. And, we can just zoom into the Manitou River watershed, where we do a lot of work, and you can kind of see a little more fine-grained look at, these priority landscapes and, this, resilient and connected landscape features out there. And you can kind of, so anyway, it's a tool that at least can help us think about where we can apply different practices on the landscape and help us prioritize some of these activities. So I think I'm going to stop here. And just before I do want to do a couple quick acknowledgements. Julie Ederson from University of Minnesota Duluth has just been a fantastic partner for us. And, the Superior National Forest in particular, Katie Frecker, anyway, they have been just great partners for us as well. So yeah, I think that's all I've got for today. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Meredith and Mark, for those presentations. We do have a few minutes at the end here before the hour for questions. So if folks have those, I'd encourage you to chat them in via the chat feature. If you prefer to ask it via voice, you can also unmute yourself and ask a question that way. So yeah, I guess maybe while we wait for questions to come in, if there are any, I can kick us off with one that's kind of directed at both of you. So, you guys both talked about, how do we prioritize areas on the landscape to target our reforestation actions, which I think is really great. And it was a little hard to tell from the maps, but it looked at like a lot of the areas that you're working are kind of adjacent to public lands or already protected lands. And I was kind of wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what the contribution of private landowners to all of this has been, like how you're kind of navigating that land ownership question.
Mark, do you want to take a quick?
Yeah, I can make a quick stab at that one. Yeah, I mean, you're right. Clearly, private lands are really important. It's more challenging just because of, small ownerships and, just being able to, communicate with people is is difficult. I mean, I think, some of these, collaborative groups like the North Shore Forest Collaborative, for instance, provides a way to contact and communicate with, private landowners who are interested. But, I think I mean, I don't have a good answer for how we do that. Maybe Meredith has some thoughts.
Well, yeah, so I do know that to some extent, these large swaths of public lands were somewhat elevated in the analysis just by virtue of having that extra protection status. But increasingly, the Nature Conservancy is recognizing the potential of working with private landowners in some of these larger landscapes like the Manitou or like the North Shore Highlands, for example. Just a shout out to the Sugarloaf North Shore Stewardship Association, for example, and all the great work that they are doing with private landowners in that area. One of the things that we are dreaming about currently is bringing a new program in conjunction with many partners to Minnesota called the Family Forest Carbon Program, where really you get a bunch of landowners all aligned around some of the same goals, kind of that same landscape collaborative model, but really getting a lot of private landowners together to work towards a big goal like biodiversity conservation or climate adaptation or mitigation and carbon. So yeah, you're right. I think that the network itself is sort of weighted toward some of those larger public holdings, but not entirely. And we sort of look at the inverse of that landscape and some of the fringes around those priority places as being potential for restoration. And that's another analysis we would like to do in the future. And private landowners will play a big role in that.
Great, thank you so much. We do have a question that came in via chat. This is one about the resilient and connected lands analysis. Are there any plans to conduct an analysis in other countries, or is that impractical?
Well, first of all, hi, Phoebe. I see that this question is from you. It's nice to see your name on here. So I have a couple of answers to this. Well, first of all, we can dream. We hope that we would be able to do something like this around the world. The Nature Conservancy is a global organization, and right now that's actually causing a little bit of strife because in North America, we really would like to start using this tool to drive all of our conservation work, but we don't have this layer available worldwide at this point. And we know that it took us 10 years to develop this for the US. So It's interesting because there have been some attempts to use a similar framework to drive ocean conservation. We have just recently gotten new funding awarded from Doris Duke to do this analysis in Alaska and Hawaii. So that's coming up next, as well as freshwater resources in the United States. So right now, at the level we've attempted this, to do it in other parts of the world, I don't know that it just seems like a really big lift. So you kind of nailed it there, Phoebe, but it seems like there should be some sort of a rapid assessment analog that could be completed that would be similar. So that's the best I've got right now.
That's great, thank you. Is there anyone out there who wanted to ask a question by unmuting themselves? Okay, I'm not hearing anyone chime in immediately, so we did get another one via chat. How would one get involved in participating in land restoration projects with the Nature Conservancy, either as a volunteer or as an employee or subcontractor, specifically tree planting?
Well, so I'll chime in here to start off the bat. We have a really excellent career explorations page. So that's one thing, because nature.org /careers has all of those. Mostly these would be seasonal job listings if you're looking for actual employment with the Nature Conservancy. And tree planting by and large starts south and moves north, you know. And so there's an extended season that way. If we start looking at like our Louisiana, Alabama chapters. And then Mark, do you want to say anything about volunteering, subcontracting?
Yeah, I mean, those, you know, certainly volunteering, I mean, we've certainly done that. And, you know, when we can arrange it and make it work, you know, it's usually we're doing that with sort of organized groups of people, you know, where there's, you know, a bunch of people that want to get out there and do some planting or some other work like that, you know. But yeah, there are, I mean, certainly, you know, that would probably most likely happen through our forest program, our kind of resilience forestry program. And so, yeah, that's, you know, certainly it happens. And, you know, there's other stuff besides tree planting too, that's, you know, part of that work.
And we used to say, call the Duluth office, but of course we're all working from home right now.
Yeah, I know, right.
But our forester's name is Chris Dunham, and that's all of the subcontracts kind of get run through his shop.
Yeah, I mean, you could still call the Duluth office and leave a message for Erin Johnson, and then she could, you know, get back to you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, very, very practical, practical question. So I appreciate you guys chiming in on that. I thought when I called for folks to maybe unmute and ask a question before, Madison cued me in that she thought she saw some mute buttons come off. So does anyone want to ask a question? I just didn't give you enough time.
This is Jim Hawkins from Sierra Club. How does this information, which is really quite dramatic, I think, how do you integrate that into working forest management where there's a continuing harvest activity?
Right. So that's a great question. A lot of these landscapes, of course, are working forest landscapes, and a lot of the work that we've described is taking place in that context. So quite a bit of the planting that we've described is reforesting following harvest. So one of the ways that I think about this in the resilient and connected network is trying to build into our forest management, including harvesting procedures, the prescriptions that will also allow us to develop forest complexity over time. And that includes both structural complexity, having lots of big trees and snags and down logs, and also compositional complexity, having a diversity of species, and maybe starting to turn our sights towards climate adapted species in that mix. So I look at these opportunity areas as places where we might consider focusing those complexity building actions. Mark, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good summary. I mean, really a lot of, I mean, our work at least is, on harvested sites. It's all about, increasing species diversity on those regenerating stands, kind of setting the stage for having more, complex, diverse forests that regenerate, post harvest. So, yeah, I mean, I think, we've got, this new resilient connected landscapes tool. Anyways, I think we can, that's going to be really useful for this kind of work that we're talking about. So yeah, anyway, that was a great question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I see a couple other questions coming in, but I want to be cognizant of coming up on the end of the hour here. Mark and Meredith, you have a few minutes to stick around and answer a few final questions.
Definitely.
Sure.
Okay, great. So I just want to take a moment. If you have to go, since it's 1 o'clock, that's just fine. If you want to stick around and hear an answer to your question or discuss a little bit more, please do so. Maybe I'll ask Madison to post in the link to get emails about the monthly climate conversations. So if you got this forwarded to you and you want to sign up for our mailing list, you can do so. And just a reminder that our next talk will be in November, and we'll be focusing on solastalgia. So we hope to see you all back for that one. And there's the link in there if you want that. So thanks so much to all of you for joining, and we'll stick around and answer a few more questions for those of you who have the time.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. So a couple of comments came in. Mary commented that it would be nice if small private landowners could get involved via forest management plans, which is, definitely a great idea, I think. And if either of you have comments on that, I'd love to hear it. And then Elaine was asking, are herbicides or pesticides being used in your project plantings? Right.
So for the first question, I'm not quite sure if this is what you're driving at, Mary, but if you are a small private landowner and are interested in getting help with managing your land, I know that there's a very active forest stewardship planning program in Minnesota, and so that is one resource. And I know that we've got a stewardship forester up here at the Rice Lake Road office. I'm not sure where you're located, and that can actually help any of us to get started, but I'm not sure if that is answering your question or not. I think Mary is still on, but I know it looks like you're still muted.
Mary, are you able to unmute and comment more? Okay, well, maybe she'll chat into the chat box if there's a follow-up to that. Oh, she doesn't have a mic. Okay. Sorry, Mary. Let us know if you have further follow-up questions or further questions about actually getting a stewardship plan for your own property, because I'm sure there are people who could hook you up with that.
And then the herbicides and pesticides question. So we do, I know, a fair amount of site preparation. We do some brush sawing once the trees, before the trees are established, and as they're getting established, we do a lot of fencing and individual tree protection to keep the deer from browsing the recently planted seedlings. For herbicide particularly, I haven't heard Chris talk a ton about that, but I am guessing it's not out of the question.
I think, typically we don't use any herbicides. I mean, it would be a pretty unusual, circumstance for, herbicides to be used on at least any of our projects on public lands. I mean, it's not that, other people don't use them, but I think on ours, it would be rare for that to happen.
Good to know, because I know that on some of our grassland preserves, we do use a fair amount of herbicide, depending on it for invasive species control. But
yeah.
Well, I think we got through all the questions in the chat, so thanks for being willing to stick around for a few extra minutes so we could get those. So yeah, any last comments, questions before we let Meredith and Mark go for today?
Yes, I am wondering if there is a good place where we can go to get some of those southern sourced seeds so that we have more successful plants.
Right.
such a good question.
Good question.
So interestingly, so we have a new project going on for precisely that reason, Erica, with it's funded by the Institute on the Environment in collaboration with Julie Ederson at University of Minnesota Duluth, and then also David Abaz with the Northeast Regional Sustainable Development Partnership. And it is actually about starting to collect seeds from some of these more northerly or southerly populations and partnering with growers here in the Northland who are willing to grow out some of those seedlings, because we do have a lot of trouble actually getting some of those southern sources. So the study that Mark specifically talked about, I think some of those are actually available through the DNR's nursery. You would just have to specify that you want them from another seed zone to the south and west. So like, was it Central 105, Mark?
104.
104. So
Central 104, right?
yeah, there's a DNR forestry seed zone map online, and we would be able to, someone may actually have the URL and could drop it right into the chat, but they, so typically they want to sell you the seedlings that are based in the area where you'll be planting them for very good reason. That's sort of tradition. And but if you specify, I think you could make that special request.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you might have some luck with some of the commercial nurseries, but I think it's kind of more hit or miss, and you don't, you want to know where they came from, which is not always going to work either. So.
And
Right,
we can send links out with follow-up emails or post those on the Sea Grant website. So if that's something you want to share with the broader audience, then oh, hey, somebody found it.
Yeah, thank you, Melanie. I really appreciate that.
Great, how timely. Excellent. Okay, well, I know we could probably talk about this for a while, but if there's nothing else burning, I'll let Meredith and Mark go on about their day, and we'll send out a number of these follow-up materials and links that we pasted in the chat box along with the recording to this if folks want to go back and revisit anything. So thanks again for sticking around and for joining us today.
Thanks again for the invitation. We'll talk with you soon.
Talk to
See
you
next
soon.
month.